This program this afternoon is kind of a combination of the Obermann Conversations program that we run and a new partnership that we've been doing this year with Riverside Theatre, where we've been helping to organize talkbacks after some of their productions. So one role that the Obermann Center plays on campus is helping to get the voices of scholars out into the community, and also to get community members and faculty, graduate students kind of in conversation with each other. And so when Riverside Theatre came to us this fall and said, hey, we're really interested in getting some new voices into our talkbacks, so the conversations that immediately follow their productions, we were excited for that opportunity. And we've already done 2 this fall. This is the 3rd play right now in their series. And the play in question is called Every Brilliant Thing. And I'm going to invite Sean in just a moment here to my right to talk a little bit more about that play. But basically it was decided that the nature of the play didn't really lend itself to having kind of a loose conversation immediately following the play, that it was something more that people were going to be in a place to kind of ruminate and go home and think about. So we decided to take this opportunity to kind of use our other format of an Obermann conversation and invite you all here to the center this afternoon. So thank you for coming out on this cold afternoon. So we are joined today by Barry Scheirer, who is the director of university counseling and also has ties to the theater community. And so that's exciting. And then Corey Hickner-Johnson, who is a doctoral student in English, and she's also going to be participating in the Obermann Graduate Institute. And Corey writes about portrayals of mental illness in literature. And so I'm very interested in kind of the role that the arts might play in this changing conversation around mental health, which is our subtopic today. And then Sean Lewis is not only the artistic director of Riverside Theatre, but he also directed Every Brilliant Thing. So I'm going to pass it off to Sean to tell us more about the play and kind of set the container for our conversation, and then he's going to lead it from there. Thank you.
Sure. So I guess I'll steal this a little bit. So Every Brilliant Thing, in kind of a nutshell capsule, is a solo show that happens with no sets, no props, no lights, and is basically about a boy who has a child. A man who has a child. His mother was suffering from depression, and so the way that he tried to combat it as a 7-year-old is he would play this game with her where they would name all of the brilliant things in the world. And they'd be like really mundane things like ice cream or water fights or staying up past your bedtime to watch a movie. And the list just keeps growing. It starts out and there's like 10 or 15. And by the end of the show, we get up to 1 million. And as the show goes, he ages in time from being a child to being a teenager to going to college to falling in love to getting married to eventually that marriage kind of dissolving. And he starts learning as the play goes on that the list never helped his mother, but it ended up really saving his life, that there's levels of mania and depression within his own persona that he kind of was in denial of as a child. Like the way I was looking at it as a director is he spent so much of his youth and young adult life projecting everything onto his mother and trying to save her that he ends up kind of missing the signs in his own life. I will say it's probably like the worst decision for holiday programming on a basic level. I know when I got hired, it was the one play that our board, as I was coming in, had a lot of questions about of, you want to replace a one-man Christmas Carol with a show about suicide. How's that going to work? And the way I was describing it with them though, is it was multiple things. For me, I think a theater should be a community center. It should be a place where everybody feels welcome. And a play like a Christmas Carol was bothersome to me because of how Judeo-Christian focused it is, that I felt like people end up not feeling like they can go there for a month, which just seems insane to me. But I liked the ideas of fidelity and warmth. And if I could find a play that did that at the same time of year, I felt like that was all right. And also because of the levels of depression. I don't know if it's because I'm Irish Catholic or what, but there's a good amount of depression in my family. I thought a lot about how during the holidays, there's a large segment of our population who feel completely alone, and that suicides and whatnot spike at these times. So the thought was, well, let's do a piece about it. And if it's really beautiful and really funny, maybe we can get away with it. Which we've been surprised. The audience actually has been coming out, and the response has been really amazing. It is a very different type of play. There's a lot of audience participation. Basically, Tim, the main character, as he leads you through the story of his life, he's kind of pulling people from the audience to play like his dad for a moment, which sounds terrifying, except for it's really simple. He'll just be like, just sit there and say the word why to me over and over and over again. And what ends up happening is the audience is sitting in the round, so everybody's just in a circle around Tim. And what I think ends up happening in a really magical way is without any stage lights, you're seeing each other the whole time, and you're seeing each other's reaction. And you really do, I think, start to become a community in a sense where you're like, I know you're not an actor, but you did that thing with Tim and you were so brave, and I felt for you in that moment. And what we're finding, and is a big reason why we did the talk back this way, which thank you for being amenable about this. This was a big shift for us, and Jen's done great work with. But why we wanted to do the talk back this way is I started noticing we were doing some tryout performances with audiences to see how the improvs would work. And one thing we were finding is people did not want to leave the room, and we were inviting a lot of people to see these workshops who didn't know each other, and they were talking to each other at the end. And so I didn't want to break that up. And I started thinking like, well, if we don't do a talk back afterwards and we see if that's going to be continuous. And we found that it really has, as people stay in the room and strangers are talking to each other afterwards. Partially, some of the conversations are starting directly in that way, where they're like, I saw you do that scene. Were you scared? Oh, I thought you did a great job. And then that'll like transfer into being a whole conversation. So in that way, it's been really successful. And then, so I was asked to kind of pitch a question out to you guys just to kind of get a conversation rolling with it. And then part of it is like, I'm not an expert on these things. It's funny when you do plays on this, people assume you're an expert. They're like, so what do you think about depression? I'm like, I have no clue, man. I had a script.
People assume I'm an expert too, and not always either. So.
Well, then, yeah, I've gotten very good at just being like, I actually don't know anything. So I kind of want to throw out, it's a two-part question because part of it, I don't know if it's even true, is there, it feels like to me that there's, partially because of how my board responded and like some of our marketing fears, is like we've done plays this year that had to do with, like, we started off the season with a show about like police brutality and Black Lives Matters. And then we did a play about feminism and the first female president to follow that up. And no matter how divisive the subject matter or the politics are, no one has blinked an eye at any of them. But as soon as we talked about doing a show that had suicide, or even if we took suicide out of it and talked about depression, there immediately has been so the stigma of it. And I just want to throw that out to you guys is like, do you think that there's still a larger stigma about this? Because I don't know, am I just projecting it on? And if there is, why does this seem to be harder for us to talk about than other things that seem just as frustrating or divisive? Sure.
I think that's a really important question, the question of stigma. And I would refer actually to like a literary scholar. But in the play, one of the lines, the narrator says, I now realize that it's important to talk about things, particularly the things that are the hardest to talk about. So I think you're spot on, at least from my perspective in reading the play and thinking about my own experience with mental illness, that there's a huge stigma and people feel like you can't talk about it, or when you do talk about it, that you're sort of defective, or worse, people might not listen. So I think these conversations are super important, and I think that the play is addressing that among many other things.
Hi. Well, it's a very good question. Stigma. So I think we've done, this is kind of like boots on the ground conversation, right? Because I work at the counseling center and have been in campus mental health for 25 years and have sort of watched the progression of how people access services or don't access services. And we certainly have done a bang up job on reducing stigma across the years. So I had a student the other day say, you should do more marketing. And I said, we don't need to do more marketing. The weight is at the door. And so students are coming in larger numbers, and this is not just true for students on a campus, but in general, people are coming for mental health services in numbers that they never have in the past. And part of that is mental health parity, which passed, as federal law several years ago, where now health insurance companies have to pay for mental health services where they didn't have to before. But one of the things I think that still ricochets in our minds is the nature of mental health and how we even talk about it, right? So I say, I'm depressed, right? Or I'm bipolar. That's what I say. I don't say I'm cancer. I say I have cancer. And so because of the nature of how mental illness or mental health concerns feel, because it lives in my head where my sense of my identity is, there's that conflagration that happens where I'm sort of not separate in my identity from how I feel. And the worse it gets, the more I stop having the ability to sort of discern the difference between me and how I feel. And I can become my feelings. And that sort of becomes problematic as well. And so that's a little bit about what we see, where I would sort of not think twice about going to the dentist if I had a pain in my tooth. And I might even tell you, like, I got to go, I got a dentist, I've had this pain in my tooth for several weeks, and I got to go get it taken a look at. But if I was struggling with sort of really down feelings, I might tell you I'm just taking part of the day off and not tell you what it was about, because there is that kind of feeling about mental health concerns. The last thing I'll say about it, and then I'll pass it on or open up for further conversation, is I think we're having growth in trouble telling the difference between when I feel badly about something that's bad and mental illness. Those are two very different things. So I have professors call me all the time and say, oh, we just had a student death in our department and the students are really upset. Could you come over? And I said, well, why? Well, they're crying. Well, they're upset. They should be upset. Somebody died. That's what grief looks like. Well, but I'm just concerned about them. I said, well, as soon as you call me over or as soon as you tell them they have to go to the counseling service, you're telling them something's wrong. And nothing may be wrong. And so we're sort of at a generational point in terms of we can't tell the difference as much as we used to about what is feeling bad about something that's bad and what's mental illness. Anything that feels bad is wrong. And so that becomes part of the problem as well, and why there's stigma, is everything should be right. And as soon as I feel bad about something, something's wrong. And it may not be, it just may be something's bad. So.
No, it's kind of fascinating. It makes me think so much about my mom, who will not see this, I think. Yeah. I'm going to hope not. No, my mom's great, but she's someone who I notice in our family who has a hard time of dealing with when someone in our family is not okay with something. Like, she's not really great when it's like, I feel like, Mom, I'm having a bad day or I'm having a bad time. It's just, she doesn't want to hear that at all. Because it's interesting what you're saying to me, just hearing about it, this kind of balance between like, I feel versus I am, and being okay with it. Like, how do we get to the point of not only being okay with the feelings, but also the ability of talking about them is an interesting thing.
This is why mindfulness, the right microphone. Yeah. This is why the mindfulness movement has gotten so big, because it's sort of about being able to sort of have my feelings without judgment. Because as soon as I have feelings about, like, as soon as I'm upset, I'm not upset with myself for being upset. And now that's worse, right? It's bad enough just being upset. But now that I'm upset about being upset because my mom is on my back about feel better, and I'm like, I can't feel better, I feel bad. Is now I'm like, now I have to deal with your judgment about it, and I start to take that on as well. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I think that's one of the issues that I see both in myself and in students, is that there's sort of a pressure to perform, like you're okay performing normal. And that's one of the things I've really been looking at in my own work a lot, is when do people have to feel like they have to perform normal, and how damaging that can be. So I think that's a really important topic.
For sure.
I'm curious too, because you've been doing a lot of your study and writing is about this. So I'm kind of just curious, like, what do you focus on in your writing, or what are the trends or topics that you seem to either notice a lot or seem to be the most fascinating?
Well, largely I work under the field of disability studies, and mental illness can or cannot be characterized as a disability. That's sort of beside the point for my work. I look at how characters feel in texts and how they identify with their own mental illnesses and how they deal with those. For example, I'm working on a chapter right now from a book called Don't Let Me Be Lonely. It's a work of lyric poetry by a poet named Claudia Rankine. And throughout the poem, she deals with her own experience with depression and with medication and how medicating can be stigmatized too. So I look at the characters, and I'm not there to diagnose. I'm not a doctor or a psychiatrist. That's not my work. My work is to say, how is this person feeling, and really investigating those textures of feeling and those affects. Oh.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, sounds great.
Will I pass? No.
Absolutely.
I think I feel a relationship to that, because I feel like in the room I'm doing the same thing with text, right? Like, it's not about me judging or making a kind of doctoral response to, but it is so much of looking at character and us sitting down and going like, where exactly is this coming from? And it's funny, of late, and I get on little kicks of this, and so it changes month by month, but I notice so often in a lot of characters that I'll be working on, I'm getting ready for the Shakespeare Festival and some freelance opportunities, and I'm looking at a lot of those characters and also the characters in Every Brilliant Thing, and I'm noticing how often like the general trope of isolation and loneliness plays into the character, like both bad behavior but also like madness. Like when you actually are getting into characters who, like you have in Shakespeare, a lot of characters who have manic tendencies, who like will kind of go off on these large fits of megalomania. And I think for whatever reason, like there's been times where I've taught it in classes or guest workshops, and for some reason people always just go like, well, it was Shakespeare's time, so people behaved like this. And I'm like, no, this is crazy. This is always crazy. Like, it's always insane to do this thing. And I just wonder, like, in terms of that, like how loneliness or isolation plays into with depression, like just things that either of you notice about it.
Sure. There's a gentleman who goes around the country speaking about suicide. I can't recall his name, but I'll tell you the particulars of his story, because he's a one in the world. So he's one of the few people that jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. It is so high off the ground that you're going over 100 miles an hour and some when you hit the water, and it basically you get pulverized. And he survived. So he goes around campuses and communities, sort of talking about this once in the world kind of experience. And what he basically says is he's the guy who struggled with depression all of his life, who walked all the way to the Golden Gate Bridge, walked onto the bridge, climbed over the barricades, stood on the edge, and let go. And as soon as he let go, he regretted it, right? And one of the things that he said is, one of the things that drove him to do it is that he even had the fantasy. He said, like, if one person will sort of smile at me or say hello to me on the way to the bridge, I won't jump. And of course, nobody did. So here's a guy in a city of millions waiting for a smile, and he doesn't get it. But even sort of within that is holding out hope and has ambivalence about the very act that he's putting a lot of effort into sort of accomplishing. And so it's a very unique perspective, but it's somebody sort of talking about the nature of mental health concerns, which is when they sort of live up in our head only, it's bottomless. It's the loneliest place for concerns to live because there's no bottom to it. And so that's one of the reasons why we sort of like say, tell someone, talk about it. Because as soon as I talk about it, it starts to take on a different form and starts to get shape, and the image of it changes. And then I sort of tell you, and then you sort of make facial, movements about it, and that sort of gives me feedback. And so it stops being as lonely and bottomless, because again, as I like to say, when things only live in our head, it's a enormous, bottomless, frightening place for things to live, because there's no end to it, and it can be a really lonely, lonely place. So.
Should we open to some questions?
Actually, I had a question.
Sure, great.
Hello.
It is yours. Give it a shot.
Okay, so I'm curious. This kind of goes back to the stigma issue of the role of art in helping to destigmatize. And I mean, it seems like art has a huge role to play. I think of something as, which now seems goofy, but old movie, Rain Man, of like bringing something like that to a larger public conversation and having something that people can all be like, oh, and look at. And then for some people, that being an opening for a conversation. So, we have two people here with ties to theater. We have somebody from literature. Certainly there's all the visual arts, but how can art help to make this conversation, I want to say, go even a little faster. Like it's not just about destigmatizing it, but it's about even rearranging our understanding that, that we're all on some spectrum, that this isn't an us-them thing. And how are any of you seeing good examples of art doing this, or other ways that you think it could play into it?
One of the arguments I'm making in my dissertation is that literature, and I suppose the arts overall, is sort of a privileged genre or privileged way to learn about mental illness. We have a lot of data from science, and that's really great and really important, but it's very quantitative, and it doesn't show the textures and the depth and the conflicts within our own feelings when we are struggling with our mental health. And I think literature is a way that can show those feelings. We're sentient beings, we're humans, and our feelings are complex and difficult and fraught. And I think literature and the arts can show that in ways that science can't always account for.
Yeah, I would agree. The art's such a great thing. And so one of the things that we see on campuses all the time is that the students will put together an event on campus to talk about body image, or they'll do a program or an event on campus to talk about depression. And it always involves students being able to write something or make a handprint of something or draw something. And there's sort of a desire to kind of help students give language, and art certainly is language, even if it doesn't use words, for folks to express themselves for the reason I said earlier, which is if it lives just in my head, it's kind of a bottomless thing. The other side is also true. We have to be careful about it. So I watch images of psychologists in the media, and we're all extremely unethical. We tend to eventually sleep with our clients. We're insane, and we tend to get sort of major breakthroughs and everything kind of wrapped up and fixed before the first commercial break. And it doesn't sort of work like that. So, post-production editing would be a great thing for my work, but I just don't have it. Or writers, to sort of write how things should go. And so the boots in the ground world, we sort of have to combat a little bit of the images that are done sort of in TV or movies because of the way it gets portrayed, which can make it seem, like you said, much less complex than it really is. So I can see the upsides of it for folks having a way to express and have language, but the downsides of it too is that it often shapes things in ways that just aren't really how it works.
Yeah, this is literally my bread and butter of what I do, and it's always a challenge. My belief is very much that art can help, and that each show should have a tangible goal. I'm always trying to think, if we're programming something, is there an actual thing in the community that could be created out of this? Or in this, my biggest thing was, can that room become a community by the end of the hour that they watch the show? Can that be a tangible goal? And sometimes we succeed at it. Sometimes we fail miserably. We definitely had a moment a week ago where we were asked to come and present a scene at the College of Public Health for some of the professors there. And it was a moment where I was watching Tim do the first 10 minutes of the show, and I was just like, I wish that I could figure out how to tour this show to everything except for a theater. Because it's the type of show, because it doesn't need anything, and Tim's kind of, I was saying beforehand, as we were talking about it, that one of the hardest things for Tim, who's a well-known actor in town, has done God knows how many productions. I've been spending the entire period of this rehearsal process trying to tell him, you can't act in this show. It can never feel like you're acting. You cannot perform. And he's been going what are you talking about? And because performance is a level of an armor, and there's a level of craft to it. And I'm like, it literally has to feel as informal as like how we're talking right now, or the people that you're asking to act with you will not be as magical or beautiful. And the performance as a whole will have a level of artifice that the subject matter and the story that you're telling does not. And when we took him to the College of Public Health and seeing him do like 10 minutes with them, there was a moment where I was just like, I wonder what it would be like to do this for a group of junior high kids, like in a classroom. Like, I just wonder how, in terms of when you're talking about like stigma versus normalization, I think it's really important. Sometimes I get worried, I think it's really good to do like nuanced performance. Like, we're doing a show about body image, and I'm going to write a piece and I'm going to perform it for people who have a care about that piece. I think that's incredibly important, but I'm also constantly trying to ask myself, how do we move it from being a performance not just for the people who care about the subject matter? How do we move it into a place, because that's where I'm like, I feel like normalization truly starts to happen, right? Is where if I have my mom in a room with a group of 6th graders who are acting rowdy, and Tim starts doing this piece and they start to connect with him as a person, it gets a little bit harder, I think, to go to look at another kid in your classroom who's saying like, who's sad a lot, and going like, no, he's just the sad kid. Or my mom going like, your brother's always complaining, like, versus her actually getting to connect with the person. And I think, so that's a thing within the art. I'm constantly trying to figure out or find pieces that can do that. And it's hard. Finding the pieces has been hard.
I have a comment. I think part of the problem in having the general public understand this and maybe be sympathetic or understanding is that at least I think of 2 different kinds of mental illness. And I think that most of the public can understand when people fail or lose their job or bad things happen to them, then they get sad and depressed. And that's unfortunate, and it's real, and it's serious, and it's a terrible thing, and in the extreme could easily be termed mental illness. The way that I think of this is a different form of mental illness when you have some brain biology that's inherently different. And these people have episodes, and sometimes are never normal, and you can tell by talking to them that they're not well. And I think those people often do terrible things to society. Society does terrible things to them as well. But I think that part of the problem is that if the mental illness is portrayed as somebody who's clinically depressed and sad because they failed at school or something else terrible happened to them, public doesn't quite can think, well, gee, that's if that person only worked harder or something good happened to them or somebody was nurturing, they'd be okay. And that doesn't happen with somebody with a biological disorder in the brain.
Yeah, I think, that's a very good point. We have a number of students here on this campus who academically are doing fairly well until, there's sort of an episode where they're sort of not doing well overall, who have chronic mental illness. And will constantly have chronic mental illness, and sort of it's kind of in the chronic manageable disease category, like we might think about diabetes, where I will always have this, and if I don't care for it, it can get worse and start to really sort of wreak havoc. One of the things that we really struggle with folks, especially folks who are wanting to sort of have a life and live with their mental illness, is there can be such a strong presence of that identity. My first sense of myself is as someone who is broken, damaged. And part of it is sort of my own internal sense of that. And then part of it is also sort of my perceptions of others' perceptions of it. And so we're constantly working with folks because of the nature of what I said earlier about sort of where that sort of feels like it lives in us, which is where my sense of myself is folks who are living with chronic mental illness, how to help them have an identity that's not one that's just mentally ill, so that they can continue to function and be in the world when they feel able to do it. So.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the difficult nature of diagnosis, because on the one hand, you're like, oh, there's a name for this, there's a title, there's a label for what I'm going through. But on the other hand, it can name something that feels like you're broken or messed up. So I think diagnosis is a really sort of dual meaning situation.
I have a question about diagnosis, so this is perfect. So in my really very limited knowledge of psychopathology, oftentimes diagnosis involves a recognition of an impediment to daily functioning. So something is severe enough that it impedes on your ability to function in the day-to-day. And I understand the usefulness of that metric, but it seems to me there's something that seems unsatisfactory about it, especially when what constitutes being able to function daily is so dependent on, various aspects of your intersectional identity, your class, your race, your gender, and that what's viewed as normative is dependent on those as well. So with that in mind, how does diagnosis function as far as the way mental illness is perceived in society, and how might we trouble our conceptions of what is normal and how that is like universalized across populations?
Well, disability studies scholars are working now to show that there is no normal, or that normal is sort of an average of an average of an average. There's a scholar named Ian Hacking who writes about that. So on the one hand, there is no normal, but on the other hand, we still have society enforcing societal norms, or norms that we believe in our heads about ourselves. So again, normal is a very contested term too. I think you're right on.
Yeah, so mental health diagnosis is a funky creature, right? So it's syndromic, right? It's a syndrome-based taxonomy, meaning that what we do is we sort of look at clusters of symptoms that seem to occur together across populations, and so we decide when those symptoms occur together, we call it this. So it's syndrome-based. And physical disorders can be syndrome-based. You think of things that have the name syndrome in it. Autoimmune deficiency syndrome, where clusters of things tend to occur together, and so we're calling it a thing. So based on that, we could not call it a thing, right? But we have decided to do that. And it is very culturally based. So homosexuality used to be a mental disorder, right, until 1973, when the American Psychological Association decided, well, the science was really lousy on this. We're going to declassify. It got declassified, meaning that it no longer was sort of a diagnostic category. Or we used to have a thing called gender identity disorder, and now it's called gender dysphoria. And so it's not a disorder anymore. It's just that you're kind of unhappy about it, or you're troubled by society's sort of reproach to you. And so that allows us to sort of then cluster symptoms together when it's about that. So the very, 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 very first diagnostic manual in psychology, which was called the DSM, we now are in DSM-5. And they've actually moved it from Roman numerals to sort of, like the number 5 as we know it. So now we can do like 5.1 and 5.2. When it was Roman numbers, it was like, oh gosh, now we got to do 4 because you can't do anything with 3, so that we can update it more regularly. But the first one had a thing in it called hobo personality disorder. And it's kind of what we would sort of now call malingering. But we used to have a thing called hobo personality disorder, and it was a thing in the late 40s, which was sort of these like transient kind of men usually that kind of rode the railways and ate beans out of cans in people's back, that kind of thing. And so it was kind of seen as this malingering personality. But then society changed, and so our perception of what was mental illness changed as well. There are communities in Europe where there's a higher proportion of people with schizophrenia, the thing that we would call schizophrenia here, living well. And it's because those communities have decided these people will stay with us. And we will sort of shape ourselves as a community to sort of allow folks to stay in the community and live. And so it brings up questions about like, well, what is the nature of mental illness? It's because we don't like it? Or if we sort of removed if the normals kind of like reshape themselves to sort of allow everyone to sort of stay in the community, maybe it wouldn't be mental illness. It would just be sort of the nature of that person. So there's a lot of kind of cultural, social impingements around diagnostics, especially since it's syndromic in its nature, which is we just clustered symptoms together and called it something. So
I'm just kind of I'm fascinated by that last part of it, because it almost sounds in a way like what you're saying is that with those populations or communities where you have people who have like what we would call schizophrenia, that the community has kind of said like, well, we're not acknowledging it as a us as a community are not stigmatizing or acknowledging it as a negative quality. It's just part. It's just part of our community. So we are going to operate within what you're suffering from, which is kind of a really fascinating. I'm just kind of wrapping my head around that as an idea. Which isn't really a comment. It's just me.
We tend to warehouse folks who really struggle with chronic mental illness, right? That's sort of our approach, is to sort of either medicate that person, and medications, especially if it's real chronic kinds of things, is going to have a really heavy, typically sedating kind of thing or a flattening kind of quality to a person, and so they can't be themselves. So that part that sort of is still, like I talked about earlier, we're really trying to help somebody like have a identity of self that's outside of one's illness, gets flattened out. And so there's a struggle within that as well. And so if we really can help somebody and support somebody, especially when they're not having a day or a week or a month where they're not doing very well, then it sort of changes the nature of how somebody thinks about themselves and the symptoms that they're struggling with.
Anybody else? Yeah. And I'm also at some point interested in if the MAD movement, if you have any thoughts on that. But I'll pass that.
So I would again like to make the case that I don't think this is a continuum, and there are some people with severe mental illness that need to be institutionalized, and I think we need to accept that and understand that. My question is, what plans? I was hoping to hear some discussion about how to help society understand mental illness in this talk, and what steps should be taken or are being taken, or if you have some ideas.
I don't have anything from a clinical perspective, but I can speak to my experience in the classroom. This past semester, I taught a class called Disability and Difference, or Literary Misfits, Disability and Difference. And my students, I had several works of literature in that class where characters were struggling with mental illness. And there were so many points in the class where the students I have them write to me, just sometimes at the end of class. So many moments where students would say, "Oh, this character gets me. They understand," or, "Oh, I never knew it was really like this. We read The Bell Jar." So I think literature is one mode for people to understand more about what people might be going through, or how it feels, to have more empathy. And empathy is sort of a fraught thing too. But to look inside someone else's perspective, to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I think that can be helpful in society because, like you're saying, a lot of times mental illnesses are thought of as bad, or people who struggle with them are thought of as, malevolent. And so if people can read more about those experiences, even though there may be trouble with the portrayals sometimes, I think that our society can learn more and can become more empathetic.
I think your question is interesting. I think there's some definitive problematics that come up with it, right? Because what you're asking about is how does the public get educated or get to feel more empathy for these issues in a way? And the way that we disperse information most commonly in our lives at this point are either through scientific and numerics, or we do it very often through art and storytelling of some kind. The problem in each is I'm someone who works in art. One thing we stay away from is numbers in a play are death. The minute that I start going 275,000 people suffer from this, the audience is checked out by the second time I've done a number, because we just start to go oh, it all kind of blends together and it doesn't fit within the storytelling model of it. The problem on the storytelling end is that we have a very definitive commercialist model of storytelling, right? You watch TV, you watch movies, everything is kind of written in a 3-act structure. So basically what some of the things that we're talking about, that as you're what you've seen of psychologists, and you're by the time we get to the commercial break, I'm wow, they've really done a lot of damage to my profession, right? Is because what they're doing is they're driving towards the character and the act break, and they have a definitive way of writing beats. The stuff that I get really fascinated by are things that have been overlooked, that have been there forever. I don't know that I've read a play that made me understand Alzheimer's better than King Lear. I look at that play underneath the science that we have now, and I see a man who who everyone talks about in that play as being completely beloved, who brings his 3 daughters before him to tell them how much they love him, and then just starts ranting wildly and has to go out completely undressed in the heath and is screaming at a storm. Like everything he's doing, you start looking at it and you're like, wow, this guy's so irrational. Who would ever understand this? This is complete nonsense. But under a different frame, underneath a different lens, I start to go like, oh no, I'm starting to understand this character in a way I don't think I ever would before. So I think part of where it is of like how to get people towards it is, one, you'll need like braver storytellers who are okay with fighting the structure they've been taught. Because like what you were talking about, you mentioned before, right? Like definitively that like, I think that there's people who need to be institutionalized who suffer like a definitive biological madness. And there's some people who, like what you listed were conflicts. I lost my job. And so the audience sees that and they go like, on a storytelling level, I see they lost their job. I understand they lost their job. As a writer, I'm never taught how to write a character who just is mad. And so that becomes a new thing I have to train myself if that's a character or an issue that I want to confront. Is like, we're taught all the time. I mean, you were working in theater too, is like everything's about action and consequence. I do this and this happens. And because of that, 5 other things happen. And then these other things happen. So when you get into a character who actually is mad, how do you operate with it? Like, because I know in a rehearsal room, you're spending all of your time building logic. It's just a matter of, and there's some playwrights and I think some experimental writers who do this really well. It's just that experimental playwriting and experimental film is not the stuff that you guys are going to like go out and see. I think some of the work actually does exist. It's just, I think sometimes it's also on the audience, you know, of like being willing. This is something I fight with at our board meetings all the time, because trust me, there's plays I'm constantly pushing towards them that they're like, you're out of your mind. But I'm like, I think our audience needs to understand this a little bit better, and this does it in a way they've never seen before. And so I think that the work a lot of time actually does exist. It's just we as an audience and the storytellers have both been trained in a way of how to have a conversation. Sometimes that's not the best way of having the conversation, you know. I don't know if that's a suitable answer, but it's definitely where I feel like a lot of this, at least from what I do, lives.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Well, Sean, I know we've got arts and science here, and I come from the legal background. And I think, unfortunately, almost all of our responses and our expectations are shaped in large part by how we classify people, whether children and adults, both in access to services, and whether we're going to commit people, institutionalize them, protect them, and sort of extend their civil rights. And I think that's had a lot to do with sort of damaging portrayals, and also people saying, why should Len get this? Be treated differently, if not favorably, at work, just because he's a very strange person. I'm doing the same job. So that was just one thing. And the second thing, I'm just wondering, maybe you should trust your audiences a bit more, because I was at the play, and I was thinking that when you were observing people walking out, I would have thought that was the opportunity. You forge a community who's going to be there. And I thought that was a perfect time to sort of harness or exploit a conversation by maybe not Tim, but someone like Barry or someone like you, just to have that and not talk about the play, but talk about what's your response? What do you think of this type of character? How have you experienced in your life? And I think that would provide some of the education. I know there's a big risk to it, but I think when you're talking about doing grand rounds over at public health or doing it with schools, I think having an actor and then some more skilled people who could facilitate that might open up the discourse and educate. But I don't know. But we have come a long way with stigma. I know people think about that when I first got involved with HIV here, decades ago, they were institutionalizing people and taking their children away at birth. So, to me, the depression issue, based on clients and advocacy I do, it's really the biological disorders when people, the behavior, and whether it's violent or not, that we have a great deal of difficulty addressing. And I think a lot of that is promoted by just our media coverage. If it's on TV, it's got to be violent or bloody. So thank you for putting on the play, and thank you.
I remembered. I'm curious what your perspectives are on the discourse around resilience. And, of course, we see this sort of catchphrase come up all the time, and even like the day of disasters, people are already talking about resiliency. And what made me think of it was your anecdote about the student who died, and the department wanting to bring you in. And
I went, by the way.
Yeah. But it seems, to me at least, like a cop-out. Because, people, there are real, genuine like painful reactions to terrible situations and to, terrible, deep emotions. And I think, my perspective is that just drawing out resiliency, well, people don't always get stronger. People do need help and resources. But I'm curious what your perspectives are on that discourse of the idea of resilience.
What do you think of it? I'm just curious. What initially, what's your sort of thought? I'm curious what your thought is on it initially, on the resiliency movement.
I thought that I said I think it's a cop out. But I think it's good to identify that, people I guess to not jump to pathologizing people. But that also, I don't think it's fair to just like whip out resilience and then, not do anything to help people in need.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So if I can sort of speak in probably like overly broad brushstrokes. So, my generation, I'm 51, my generation, we were the latchkey kids, right? My generation was the generation when both my parents worked and they gave me a key and said, when you get home from school at 2:15, we'll be home at 6. Entertain and soothe yourself. Figure out how to do that. And if you hurt yourself, stop the bleeding and we'll be home by 6, like that kind of thing. Like, take care of yourself. So my generation grew up sort of feeling abandoned by my parents, and so we became the helicopter parents, right? Our generation was the one that would sort of never do that. So my generation stepped in and took care of everything, and everybody got a blue ribbon, and we didn't give awards unless everybody got an award, like that sort of thing. And maybe we could reshape this because the kids are a little anxious about this, and why should they have to feel anxious? You're right. So maybe we shouldn't send letters out like that. Maybe we'll meet individually with everybody so nobody feels anxious. And so the outcome of that is, every generation has its upsides and its downsides. And this generation, the one that we're currently have at the university, they're one of the more civically minded generations I've seen in a long time. And they're brilliant in their ability to sort of feel like they can master the world in front of them because they can get their hands on almost anything. But their ability to emotionally regulate is not so good. That's not this generation's best skill. And so anything that feels bad seems bad. And so the idea of resiliency, I think, is simply sort of a movement that's got it started because people need it. I didn't need resiliency training because my parents said, we'll be home at 6, soothe yourself. Figure out how to entertain yourself. So I figured that out. This generation hasn't had to do it. And, my generation also, I got the news 30 minutes a day and that was the end of it. And I sort of didn't have to be exposed to the world all the time. And this generation struggles to have resiliency and mindfulness about everything, and they're exposed constantly to everything. And it's a toxic combination. So when I see people out teaching resiliency, my hope is kind of what you sort of said is a cop-out, which is we shouldn't minimize that people really do struggle. But I think one of the nice things of the resiliency and the mindfulness movements, and they're kind of overlaps, grit is the other word we hear a lot about, teaching people to have grit, is it's something the generation needs because of their vast overexposure to really awful things. Like I can be aware of every disaster and every murder and death that happens in the world every day if I wanted to. And some of them are real and we're avoiding, some of them are not. Right? There's all this false news now that I have to figure out how to manage. And so I think there's some purpose to resiliency in broad brushstrokes given sort of what this generation's strength is not. So
it's
kind of fascinating. It doesn't, I mean, I'm not a professor, but like I do see a difference in actors, like in actors of different ages. I mean, that's who I spend most of my time with. And it's almost exactly what you talked about. Like the actors that I work with who are older are often less civically minded, more as they would call it old school, about not only how they handle themselves as an actor and in the profession of acting, like they'll show up at the way how they show up, how they prepare, how they do everything. It's like, this is how you do it, but also how they kind of live their lives. Where I'm finding a lot of the younger actors I work with are very civically engaged, very much about like the work we have to do has to be much more meaningful and powerful and this and that. But I would say also on an emotional level, like how they're able to approach disparate ideas in plays is more difficult. I definitely see a reticence in younger actors to play characters that they do not agree with, which as a director is death. And I find myself in most of my conversations trying to talk about the fact of like, I don't care if you agree with them or not. Like he's saying that, he means it. Like, I mean, I can tell you as a director that he means what he's saying. And I found that really kind of fascinating. Also their level of both distraction and multi-management is great, is amazing. Like how they're able to because I'll have actors who they're off stage and they're on their cell phone and like they've sent like 5 texts and they've Facebooked about the show. Like I'll find this out as I go home. I'm like, they were paying no attention when they were off stage. And then I'm like, well, they were sent out 1,800 messages about the play. But on a flip side of that, their ability to leave stuff at home or off the stage is really bad. Like how they're feeling when they enter the room and like the thing that has nothing to do with the work we're doing that has been bothering them before we start. And it's like, I'm never someone who likes to kind of categorize. I mean, the theater, I think, does its best to try not to, but it's a fascinating difference that I learn in every play that we work on, where I'm like, the difference in the ages of the actors, it's down to a T that I'm like, this is very consistent.
One of the, in like from a disability studies perspective, I think resilience is a really difficult, again, I keep saying these words are fraught, but we're in the United States of America, we have this whole bootstraps, like Emersonian, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, grit, like make it through. But the fact of the matter is that we really rely on each other for a lot of things every day. The road you drove on today, and I'm going to sound like a liberal Democrat, but like that's tax dollars, right? We are enmeshed, and we need each other in ways that we don't realize every day, from a physical level, I think, to an emotional level. And so the thing with resilience, I consider myself a resilient person for what I deal with, but at the same time, I need other people, and I need my therapist, or I need my friends, I need my family. So I think resilience is it's an important thing to have, but we also have to realize that none of us are completely bootstraps, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, individual. That's just not true. It's not true.
Especially since we can also get pulled down by our bootstraps.
Yeah.
Bootstraps are not a single direction, right?
That's such a good point.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Right.
Like the Emersonian man is not real.
No.
You heard it here. I think we have time for one final question.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of art and storytelling in kind of destigmatizing mental illness. And one thing I always notice is that the burden of talking about it is always on the person who has mental illness. It's Sylvia Plath who had to write the novel. It's William Faulkner who had to write the novel. And it's almost... and when someone finally does get the courage to open up and talk about their mental illness, if they make others uncomfortable, it's suddenly their fault. Like I have really bad depression, and I can say my depression was so bad I couldn't even get out of bed. I couldn't feed myself. And the person I'm telling that to becomes uncomfortable, and then the burden of making them uncomfortable is suddenly on you. So how can storytellers who maybe don't have to worry about those kinds of things, how can they start making art about mental illness to try and combat that difficulty?
Seems like a very question. I wish I pondered that question myself. So I have empathy to the question because I ponder it myself all the time. I'm not sure exactly what the response to it. The thing that came up in mind in response to your question was the students this year, they actually did it last year and sort of put it out this semester, is a thing called True at the U. I don't know if anybody saw the True at the U videos. So they did a really nice job. Basically, there was about a dozen students that stepped forward and said, I want to go on camera and talk about my struggle with mental health concerns or mental illness. And then, the tagline was, I'm Barry Schreier, I'm True at the U. This kind of was sort of the moniker. And one of the things we talked about then they come to the counseling center and say, advise us on how we should do this. And so we said, well, be careful about putting stuff out on the web, video-wise, because the university thinks it's great. A future employer may not. And once it's out there, so be thoughtful about it. But I said, why don't you interview folks as well who, either provide service to folks who have mental health concerns, so you're getting somebody's perspective from that, and maybe you could interview a sibling who sort of is not the person with mental health concerns, but is the sibling of somebody who grew up with someone who had that? Or why don't you interview someone who just has a perspective about this and sort of the idea of why does it always have to be, we see that with race issues and sexual orientation and gender. It's always got the people sort of who have to carry the banner. And so they added all these additional voices. And whether it sort of changed the nature of that initiative for the campus, I don't know. I don't have the research to say sort of what the impact of that was. But I would agree, every movement needs its allies and champions. And so that was one thing I was thinking. That's something that just came to mind in response to what you're talking about. But it's a great question that I ponder as well.
I think I'm going to talk about a few dirty words in it, probably, is the people who really control the plays that you get to see and the plays that are going to get created on one level are the producers, right? Who decides that when I'm producing something at Riverside, I decide what's going to go up there. But also that's decided by who comes to see the shows. The audiences have an amazing amount of power. And the reason why I'm saying this is that most producers' assumption will be that any play, whether it's about the person who's the flag bearer or their brother or their sister or someone who doesn't suffer from mental illness, that a play simply about mental illness is unsellable. I know this for a fact because I've had multiple theaters contact me going you did every brilliant thing. Why did you do it? How's it going? Is it really bad? How's the box? And they're talking all about box office because some of them are fascinated by the theatricality, but they're terrified by the subject matter. And then when I tell them, and I don't know why they contact me, because then when I tell them it's going great, they don't believe me anyway, and they don't produce it. And what I mean by saying that is that I've sat here through a lot of the conversation today, and I started thinking, I'm how many plays do I actually know that are written definitively about mental illness? I'm having a really hard time.
I can think of movies.
I can think of Marat Sade and maybe Agnes of God. A lot of them have to do around religious fervor or religious madness. And most of them are not anywhere near a contemporary setting. And it's kind of fascinating to me. I bet if I looked at some European plays, it would be a little bit different, but I think that's also because of the way stuff's funded there, that there's a lot of state funding, the government funds the play, so that if you think that's a real issue, you can do that. So I think that's it's the answer no one wants, but it is the logistical loophole, problem that I think with at least the business I'm in, theater, falls into a lot, is people don't come in the first place. We're constantly desperately trying to survive or find partners. The theater company I run outside of Riverside is Working Group, and we survive and thrive because universities bring us in and we this is a problem on our campus or in our community and we have to play nice with our community. So can you make a play about this? And we've kind of created a little niche of doing that. So we've done well with that. But that's really a rare model. Running Riverside, this is my first year. It's been interesting finding out how much of my life is dictated by not that. And how much of my fights are about how to program the things that I think are important, even though everyone else thinks they're not going to sell. And so I think that's what you really are getting into is, I think as consumers, we get so used to things getting presented to us. Where I'm going to announce the new iPhone and people tune in to see I hope it, oh no, it has ear jacks that don't have a wire. I'm so mad. Why didn't they consult me? With something like theater, I think our found, what I would call more of our folk arts, you actually have a lot more control over what gets done. Like, I'll tell you right now, there's only like 15 of you in the room. If 15 of you called up my executive director and said to her, like, I loved every brilliant thing. I wish that you would do a bunch of more plays about this. Or I'm willing to donate $10 towards you guys doing more plays on this. And of course, it always comes down to money. And that's an annoying thing to hear. But I know just with 15 people doing that, because when I get 4 complaints about like the bathroom stalls weren't nice, I hear it from my executive director. So I imagine if like 10 people called in and were like, I loved every brilliant thing, and I think there has to be more plays on this, we would start having conversations for sure about that.
Action item to walk away from tonight, right? Here's an easy action item.
I think it's with all arts. I mean, I don't know as much how the university works, but I have definitely found in my life of doing theater, a lot of times with my theater company, or I do a lot of solo performance around subjects like this, the way I get brought in often is someone demands it at a place. And then they make just enough noise that they're like, I guess we have to do it. And I mean, at least on that level, that does make a pretty big difference. Like, I would love to commission plays about all the topics we don't talk about, which at some point you're going to probably see a Kickstarter from Riverside saying Sean wants to commission like 10 plays from playwrights around the country to have conversations that feel horrible. And you'll be like, hopefully you'll donate to it or whatnot. But I think that's where I mean, it's on the audiences and the producers to make those types of initiatives happen. You know, the work has to exist for it to get done. Playwrights aren't going to, we make nothing. Like, as independent playwrights, we make, like, the amount of money you make for a play is painful. Like, what he's going to make, this is selling incredibly well. He's going to make like maybe $2,000, you know? So like, if I'm a playwright and I know if I write a subject matter of this, it's hardly ever going to get produced, I'm not going to write it. Like, most of my friends, I have a lot of friends who are very successful playwrights. They're writing 4 to 5 character dramas that take place in one location that have to do about, you know, a relationship issue of some sort, because they know that, one, it'll get produced a lot, and it's an avenue for them to get television work. And that's the reality, at least in my art form, of what we're wrestling with. However, if I can turn to somebody and say, like, I got $5,000 to $10,000 for you to write a play about mental illness, and I know you don't suffer from it, but I think you're amazing, they'll write that play. So it is that kind of, it is figuring out how to make those things happen and how to support it. I mean, that's most of my day. But yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.